The body paragraphs are the most important part of your essay. It's where all the analysis is done, and the analysis is where you get all the marks. Let's go and get all the marks.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the second of 3 lessons that discuss how to write your response to a responding section question. In the previous lesson, we analyzed some introductions. In this lesson, we'll be analyzing some body paragraphs. And in the lesson after this one, we're going to analyze some conclusions. Not really much else to say. Let's get into it. Lesson objectives. We will start this lesson off by recapping the structure of a body paragraph, which, as we know from the lesson on structure 2 lessons ago, is the tube. After that, we'll recap example number 2, which is the example about everything, everywhere, all at once. Once we've done that, we'll analyze BP1, then BP2, then BP3, and outline a simple summary. Let's recap the structure of a body paragraph, aka the tube. This is the tube. This is a topic sentence. The topic sentence is a sentence that reinforces your thesis and summarizes what the body paragraph will be about. This is the elaboration. The elaboration is a sentence that provides some additional detail about something that was mentioned in the topic sentence, or states some information that you would have included in the topic sentence, but if you did, it would have made the topic sentence too wordy. Here is the example. The example is 1 to 2, no more than 3, sentences that refer to one or more relevant quotes or use meta-language to describe relevant textual evidence. Here is the example. The example is approximately 2 to 4 sentences that explain the language features used in the evidence, the effect of the evidence, and how that effect is relevant to your thesis. Here is the link. The link is 1 sentence, no more than 2, that summarizes the body paragraph's contents and links it to your thesis. So that is the structure of 1 body paragraph of your responding section essay. Then for the remaining 2, it's simply a matter of repeating that structure. As I've mentioned in previous lessons, you can, of course, duplicate the example and explain in any of these 3 body paragraphs. So instead of having TEEL with 3 E's, you would have TEEL with 5 E's. I've also mentioned previously that the question of whether or not a given paragraph will have 3 E's or 5 E's will just always depend on the question and the way that you have planned for it. Also remember that one body paragraph might have 3 E's, another might have 5, and another one might have 3 or 5. Point being, all the paragraphs don't need to have the same number of example and explains. As long as every body paragraph at least has 1 set of example and explains, you're all good. One final reminder about the structure of the tube. 3 body paragraphs is the minimum number of body paragraphs you should write in your responding section essay. Writing a 4th body paragraph is great as long as writing that 4th body paragraph doesn't compromise on the quality of writing the first 3. What I'm really saying here is if you're rushing through your first 3 body paragraphs just to write a 4th, that's probably not a good indication that you should be writing a 4th body paragraph. I would prefer for you to write 3 great body paragraphs rather than 4 average body paragraphs. That is a quick recap about the structure of the body paragraphs, aka the tube of the double-ended drinking funnel. Now let's do a quick recap of example number 2 from the previous lessons. But first, desk goes up. Good Grogu. Just in case you can't remember, here is the question for example number 2. Explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience's attitude towards an issue or concept. And of course, the text that we're analyzing in relation to this question is Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Here is a very quick recap of step 6 of the planning steps, which is the determine structure step, the final step of our planning steps. Our thesis for this question is as follows. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once is transformed the science fiction genre through its absurdist style, emotional intensity, and manipulation of structural elements to change sci-fi enthusiasts' disapproving attitudes towards absurdism. As this thesis statement indicates, body paragraph 1 will be discussing the film's absurdist style. In this body paragraph, I'll discuss Jobu Tupaki's clothing and the everything bagel, and of course, verse jumping. Then for body paragraph number 2, this will be about the emotional intensity of the movie. Specifically, we'll refer to the protagonist, whose name is Evelyn, Evelyn's relationship with her husband, her daughter, and her father. Our third and final body paragraph for this essay will be about the structural elements that Everything Everywhere uses. This body paragraph will specifically discuss the embedded stories that it has within, including the fake end credit scenes. It will also look at the title being used to structure the film in 3 parts, and finally, it will look at the various shifts in time and place that the film uses. Here's an overview of all of that information about Step 6. You can find this in the PDF study notes for this lesson. As usual, I'd like you to consider how the information in this text box manifests in each body paragraph that we're going to be analyzing. Importantly, what you'll notice is that most of the information in this box does appear in the essay that we're analyzing, but some of it is actually never referred to. And this relates to a critical point about planning. It is just a plan. Sometimes you'll use all the information from your plan in your actual essay. Sometimes you won't because you realize the piece of evidence isn't necessary or you've already written enough. So bear all of this in mind as we move on. And here is the original version of the introduction for this question. Obviously, we had a look at this paragraph in the previous lesson, but if you can't remember it, pause the video now and have a quick read. That is our recap for example number 2 done. Now let's move on to take a look at the first body paragraph for this essay, which is the one about absurdist style. The rest of this lesson will be following a pretty similar structure to the previous lesson about introductions, in that we'll be looking at 3 body paragraphs and then discussing some comments in relation to each one, and those comments will really be focusing on the structure of each body paragraph and how they're using the various elements of TEEL. Here is the original version of body paragraph 1. And here is the deconstructed version. This is the topic sentence. Everything Everywhere's absurdist style assuages the overwhelm of realizing that humans exist in a chaotic universe. Here's the elaboration. An absurdist style, not to be conflated with the concept of absurdism, refers to something so intentionally ridiculous and bizarre that it feels surreal. Unsurprisingly, such a style is commonly used in comedy films to enliven a serious topic. Everything Everywhere adopts this technique in countless ways. Moving on to a fat example. One prime example is through the motif of the everything bagel, which is essentially a bagel the size of a giant beach ball that erases a person's existence across the multiverse upon being subsumed by its black hole-like center. Everything Everywhere's antagonist, Jobu Tobaki, is an omniversal being with unimaginable power, an agent of pure chaos with no real motives or desires, who proudly explains to Evelyn that she got bored one day and created the everything bagel. Jobu, who is in fact a maniacal alter ego of Evelyn's daughter, Joy, intends to destroy herself with the bagel as her multiversal existence has led her to embrace absurdism as axiomatic. Axiomatic just means so obvious, established, clear that it goes without saying. Moving on to an even fatter explain. In this way, the everything bagel is a symbol of self-defeatism, non-existence, and depression. The symbol of the bagel recurs throughout Everything Everywhere in the form of black circles with white centers, like one of Evelyn's tax invoices that has a portion of it circled in thick black permanent marker. This is counterbalanced through the motif of a googly eye, a white circle with a black center, which Evelyn sports on her forehead in the film's final act as she tries to prevent Jobu Tobaki from jumping inside of the everything bagel. Absurdity aside, the googly eye represents the antithesis of the everything bagel, a symbol of hope, optimism, and contentment. The fact that Evelyn succeeds in her quest to convince Jobu not to destroy herself with the everything bagel suggests that understanding one's relative insignificance in the universe need not be a cause for giving up on life, but rather an encouraging nudge to make the most of it. And here is our lucky link. This stuff is not falling out today. The ability of Daniels to use a googly eye and a bagel as symbols to deliver such a profound message exemplifies how the film's audience of sci-fi enthusiasts alter their attitude towards absurdism. That's our deconstructed version of body paragraph 1. Here are some comments in relation to it. Firstly, let's discuss some things about the topic sentence. The question centers on how a text has transformed genre to alter an audience's attitude about a concept. The first just how I'm talking about is the movie's absurdist style, as indicated through this topic sentence. I've also alluded to the alter the audience's attitude part of the question by noting that the absurdist style eases the overwhelming feeling of realizing your own tiny position in the universe. This sentence also refers to the part of my intro that explains that the audience initially disapproves of absurdism, but then ultimately is uplifted by it. That's our topic sentence. Now let's discuss a bit about the elaboration. 3 elaboration sentences clarify some critical points about terminology and refer to the aspect of my thesis that says that Everything Everywhere transforms the sci-fi genre by blending several other genres into it. Here in the emboldened part on the screen, we can see that I've made a very important distinction between an absurdist style and the concept of absurdism. The entirety of body paragraph 1 would have been very confusing if I didn't make that distinction. In these last 2 sentences, I explain that an absurdist style is typically adopted in comedy movies and imply that Everything Everywhere's adoption of such a style is one way in which it transforms the sci-fi genre. This example effectively conveys just how absurd the movie is by cherry-picking relevant parts of it, such as the everything bagel, omniversal being, maniacal alter ego, and intends to destroy herself with the bagel. Notice how the language I'm using in this example part of my paragraph is really reinforcing the whole idea of an absurdist style. All this stuff in bold is nuts. That is the example. Let's check out the explain. My explain explains the significance of the everything bagel as a symbol of self-defeatism, non-existence, and depression. It also explains the significance of its antithesis, which is just the opposite of something, which in the case of the everything bagel is the googly eye. And I've said the googly eye is a symbol of hope, optimism, and contentment. It then explains the relevance of the example to the thesis by saying that the audience changes their attitude towards absurdism because Jobu, who previously embraced the idea of a purposeless and chaotic universe, decides not to destroy herself. Really, what I'm saying here is that the audience is uplifted by the concept of absurdism because Jobu reframes her existence and then embraces life. Finally, we have the link. The link reinforces the topic sentence, specifically the parts that mention the absurdist style and how that eases the overwhelm of this concept of a purposeless existence, by saying that the absurd elements in the movie, like the googly eye and the everything bagel, alter the audience's attitude towards absurdism. That's body paragraph number 1. Here is body paragraph number 2, which is all about the emotional intensity of Everything Everywhere and how that draws from elements of drama movies. This is the original version of body paragraph number 2, and this is the deconstructed version. Starting with the topic sentence. Everything Everywhere transforms the sci-fi genre by incorporating the emotional intensity of a drama movie. Here is the elaboration. In turn, this emotional intensity effectively changes the audience's attitude towards absurdism by underscoring that meaningful relationships transcend one's insignificance in the cosmos. Transcends just means surpasses or is more important than. Moving on to another fat example. One scene in the film is a particularly powerful illustration of this. After Evelyn realizes the full potential of her power to traverse the multiverse, Jobu reveals that she was just looking for someone to see what I see, feel what I feel. An eye-level close-up shot of Evelyn depicts her glumly staring into the abyss of the everything bagel with Jobu, accompanied by the non-diegetic sounds of a slow-paced violin and piano. In a momentary lapse of her good character, Evelyn subsequently engages in several chaotic and reckless actions across multiple realities in a Jobu-like fashion. In one reality where Evelyn and her family are hosting a party at their laundromat to celebrate Chinese New Year, a high-angle close-up shot shows Evelyn signing a document titled Dissolution of Marriage. The camera cuts to another reality in which Evelyn is a teppanyaki chef, where she carelessly reveals to an audience of patrons that one of her colleagues has a raccoon in his toque. A toque is a chef's hat, not the other type of toque. Finally, the same initial close-up of Evelyn's glum face is rotoscoped in the center of the frame as the background switches countless times per second while jumbled, cacophonous music is playing. The music abruptly stops and the camera cuts to a close-up of Waymond, who's Evelyn's husband, whose face reveals immense pain and shock as a subsequent shot depicts Evelyn withdrawing a shard of glass from his abdomen. Now, moving on to a pretty pathetic explain. The protagonist's erratic behavior in this sequence indicates that she has capitulated to the reality of a purposeless existence. The word capitulated means succumbed to. Finally, here is the link. The emotional intensity of this moment in Everything Everywhere, heightened through the use of non-diegetic sound and frantic editing, profoundly impacts the audience and, in turn, works to transform the sci-fi genre. That's the paragraph. Let's discuss some comments. Firstly, the topic sentence. The question centers on how a text has transformed genre to alter an audience's attitude towards a concept. The second how I'm talking about is the emotional intensity of a drama movie, as stated in this second topic sentence. Turning to the elaboration. I didn't want to jam in anything about the alter an audience's attitude part of the question in the topic sentence, so I addressed it in this elaboration instead. I've essentially said that Everything Everywhere encourages the audience to understand that, upon realizing your own insignificance in the universe, it becomes clear that ultimately meaningful relationships are all that's left. Put differently, this concept of absurdism isn't something to feel down about, but it's something that should make us feel uplifted. Now, let's discuss the example. In short, it's too long. One thing I will say about this example is the use of meta-language makes up for a very short explain. Arguably, all of these examples that I've written about were necessary to convey the emotional intensity of the movie. Note, we will correct the example explain ratio by trimming some fat off this example and putting some more stuff in the explain in the review lesson. Speaking of the explain, it is too short. Although this expression has capitulated to the reality of a purposeless existence sounds pretty good, don't let it distract you from its relevance to my thesis statement, if any. We'll address what's wrong with this explain in the review lesson, but try to figure out what that is in the meantime. Finally, we've got the link. This link states the language features that heightened the emotional intensity of the examples that I referred to in the example element of TEEL. What I'm saying is that the use of non-diegetic sound and frantic editing in those examples contributed to the emotional intensity of the movie. See the LFB for an explanation of what non-diegetic sound is. Also, this link mentions the transform genre part of the question. I don't directly refer to the alter the audience's attitude part of the question. However, I allude to it by saying profoundly impacts the audience. You don't need to refer to each main element of the question in each link of your essay. As long as you refer to most elements, you're all good. That is body paragraph number 2 done. Let's move on. But first, desk goes. Our third and final body paragraph is all about structural elements in Everything Everywhere and how that draws from adventure films. Looking at the complete version of body paragraph 3, we can see that it is very long. This body paragraph's length is another thing that we'll be addressing in the review lesson. And here is the deconstructed version of this body paragraph. Starting with the topic sentence. Everything Everywhere's utilization of structural devices cleverly works to alter the audience's attitude towards absurdism. Here's the elaboration. Such devices are often employed in adventure films as a way of signposting the myriad places and times typically explored within them. Everything Everywhere uses embedded narratives, headlines, and alternating aspect ratios to delineate the various realities. However, the plot's circular structure proves most effective in making the audience feel uplifted. Here is a slightly slimmer example. The opening scene of the film takes place in the Wang family's house, which is situated above their laundromat. It begins with a wide-angle long shot of the interior of the house and depicts Evelyn centered in the frame, sitting at a dining table covered in receipts. The camera slowly slowly zooms in to become a medium shot of Evelyn frantically sifting through the receipts. Waymond enters the frame and hesitatingly attempts to discuss getting a divorce, while a tracking shot conveys Evelyn getting up from the table, tending to some food in the kitchen, and interjecting Waymond whenever he speaks. Non-diegetic sounds of a pulsating beat and violin fade in and increase in frequency as the rest of the scene establishes Evelyn's strained relationship with her daughter and father, typified by Evelyn's disapproval of Joy's sexuality and constant attempts to placate her dad's grumpy mood. Placate means to make someone less angry. Moving on to the first explain. The scene proves to foreshadow Evelyn's subsequent discovery of the multiverse and her harried existence within it. When you're harried, you're constantly being demanded of. As she comes to understand Jobu's perspective that everything we do gets washed away in a sea of possibility, the audience can't help but feel resistant towards absurdism. However, the circularity of Everything Everywhere's narrative alters this resistance. The final scene of the film essentially depicts the same events as the opening, but this time Evelyn goes about them differently. This time, having learned through her journey across the multiverse that choosing to see the good side of things is strategic and necessary, effortlessly ameliorates each relationship that was causing her grief in the beginning. The word ameliorate means make better. Here's example number 2. While dramatic choral music echoes and rises, Evelyn proudly introduces her daughter's girlfriend, Becky, to her father and giddily exclaims while embracing Joy, "We can do whatever we want, nothing matters." Explain number 2. Conveying the opening scene in this light alters the audience's attitude towards absurdism by highlighting that the relative insignificance of our existence in the universe means we can worry less and love more. Last but not least, our link. Daniel's use of a circular narrative enables the same events to be retold through a different lens, thereby encouraging the audience to reframe their outlook on life and transforming the sci-fi genre in the process. That is our final body paragraph. Let's discuss some comments. Regarding the topic sentence, we know the question centers on how a text has transformed genre by altering an audience's attitude in relation to a concept. The third how I'm talking about in this body paragraph refers to the movie's use of structural elements, which is typically found in adventure movies, and this is what I've really stated in this third topic sentence. Now the elaboration. The first elaboration sentence refers to the transform genre part of the question by explaining that the use of various structural elements is conventional in adventure movies. However, this sentence would have been more effective had it just directly stated that Everything Everywhere's adoption of that convention of adventure films is one way it transforms the sci-fi genre. The second elaboration outlines a few structural devices that Everything Everywhere adopts and highlights one that alters the audience's attitude. Do you think everything in this second sentence is necessary? We'll find out in the review lesson. Now let's discuss example and explain number 1. Despite being too long, this first example and explain do a good job of explaining how the opening scene of the movie encourages the audience to feel one way towards absurdism, and how the final scene encourages the audience to feel another way towards absurdism. Put differently, this first example and explain explains that the movie's circular structure influences the audience's attitude towards absurdism by depicting Evelyn navigating her life with ease at the end of the movie once she has experienced the multiverse. To boil this down even further, this first example and explain is saying that in adventure movies, the protagonist goes on an adventure and they're usually better for it. In this movie, Evelyn goes on an adventure through the multiverse and afterwards she is also better for it. As I said, we'll address the length of this example and explain in the review lesson. Now onto the second example and explain. The second example and explain concisely describes the final scene's critical aspects, such as when Evelyn introduces her daughter's girlfriend to her father and when Evelyn exclaims, "We can do whatever we want." So the second example and explain describes critical aspects of the final scene like that, and it explains why those aspects then alter the audience's attitude. In this final explain, what I'm really saying is that we can think of absurdism as something that's pretty depressing when you think about how purposeless and chaotic the universe is, but after seeing Evelyn's experience through the multiverse, absurdism is actually something that we should feel happy about because it makes everything feel lighter. We're not weighed down by as many things when we realize that we are just on a very tiny rock in a very tiny pool in a huge sea that is the universe. Lastly, the link. The link addresses how the sci-fi genre has been transformed, which is through the circular narrative. It also addresses the alter the audience's attitude part of the question, when it says the audience is encouraged to reframe their outlook on life. Finally, this link also addresses the transform genre part of the question, simply by saying that this process of encouraging the audience to reframe their outlook on life, in turn, then transforms the sci-fi genre or the side genre. And we're done for this lesson after a simple summary. First part of this lesson, we recap the structure of the body paragraph, which is the tube of the double-ended funnel essay structure. First element of a body paragraph is the topic sentence, which is a sentence that reinforces your thesis and then summarizes what the body paragraph will focus on. Next element is the elaboration. This is a sentence that provides additional detail about something that was mentioned in the topic sentence or states information that you didn't include in the topic sentence because it would have made it too wordy. From there, we've got the example, which is 1 to 2, no more than 3, sentences that refer to one or more relevant quotes or use meta-language to describe textual evidence. From there, we've got the explain, which is approximately 2 to 4 sentences that firstly explain the language features used in the evidence, then explain the effect of the evidence, and thirdly explain how that effect is relevant to your thesis. Finally, the last element of a body paragraph is the link. The link is one sentence, no more than 2, that summarizes the body paragraph's contents and then links it to your thesis. After our recap of the structure of the tube, we turn to looking at the 3 body paragraphs. Here are some takeaways from that discussion in relation to each element of TEEL. Regarding the topic sentence, state what you're discussing in the paragraph by reusing key terminology you used in the introduction so the marker can connect the dots. For example, I said this in the introduction for this essay, namely, everything everywhere adopts an absurdist style one might expect to see in a comedy, has the emotional intensity of a drama, and manipulates structural elements like an adventure film. I then said the following in one of my topic sentences. Everything everywhere's absurdist style assuages the overwhelm of realizing that humans exist in a chaotic universe. Notice how in the intro I'm using this term absurdist style, and then in one of my topic sentences I'm also using that term absurdist style. Reusing this sort of key terminology is helping the marker identify the structure of your essay. Turning to some points about the elaboration. Firstly, you should use the elaboration to address any key element of the thesis that you didn't refer to in your topic sentence. For example, in my 3rd body paragraph, this was the elaboration. Such devices are often employed in adventure films as a way of signposting the myriad places and times typically explored within them. You should also use the elaboration to transition to your first example. Here's an example of doing that. Everything Everywhere uses embedded narratives, headlines, and alternating aspect ratios to delineate various realities. However, the plot's circular structure proves most effective in making the audience feel uplifted. This second part of the sentence from however transitions to the example that I'm about to describe. Here are some key takeaways about the example element. Firstly, use of meta-language when describing evidence of a visual or multimodal text in the example is essential if your explain is going to be short, because using meta-language is a subtle form of analyzing, which is what you do in the explain. Here is an instance of an example that uses meta-language to make up for a short explain. An eye-level close-up shot of Evelyn depicts her glumly staring into the abyss of the everything bagel with Jobu, accompanied by the non-diegetic sounds of a slow-paced violin and piano. Compare this example that uses meta-language with the following version that doesn't use meta-language. This first version is better and it will impress the marker more. Another point about the example, don't let fancy expression take precedence over relevance to your thesis. There's a bit of irony behind this point because, in short, what it's really saying is just be clear and make sure everything you say in your essay is related to your thesis. An example of using fancy expression that doesn't relate to your thesis is as follows. Capitulated to the reality of a purposeless existence. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be addressing exactly why that phrase doesn't relate to my thesis in the review lesson. Here are some points about the explain. At the very least, the explain should firstly explain the effect of the example. For instance, the scene proves to foreshadow Evelyn's subsequent discovery of the multiverse and her harried existence within it. The explain should also explain how that effect is relevant to your thesis. For example, As she comes to understand Jobu's perspective that everything we do gets washed away in a sea of possibility, the audience can't help but feel resistant towards absurdism. Explain the effect of the example, explain how that effect relates to your thesis. Finally, a brief point about the link. A good link is one that addresses all, if not most, of the question's main elements. For example, the emotional intensity of this moment in Everything Everywhere, heightened through the use of non-diegetic sound and frantic editing, profoundly impacts the audience and, in turn, works to transform the sci-fi genre. This link refers to the how, it refers to the audience, and it refers to the transformed genre parts of the question. That's a wrap. The activities for this lesson consists of 2 parts, just like the previous lesson. You can probably already guess what each part requires you to do. At this stage, I wouldn't be surprised if you are completely sick of practice writing. I don't blame you. I'll say it again, as you're completing the activities for this lesson and everything else in English ATAR made simple, make sure you remind yourself of your why. Why are you doing this course in the first place? If you've lost sight of your why, go and check out the goal and habit contract that you completed in Module 1. That contract has your English ATAR related goal. That is why you are doing this course. That is why you're enduring all of the practice writing. So even though these activities suck, I promise you they represent the quickest path to achieving your goal. That's all from me. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep it simple.